So good evening and welcome to the East Coast Colleges Social Science Association's online ECCSSA Colloquy Spotlight. I am Rosalind King, Professor of Psychology and Chair of the Board of Directors of ECCSSA. It is a great pleasure to have you join us this evening. We have been hosting the Colloquy Spotlight now for several months, where we feature talks by significant scholars on a variety of topics. Our last colloquy began a focus on topics related to our 2021 annual conference, whose theme next year is defining and confronting the challenges of race, racism, and inequality in the 21st century, a state-of-the-art assessment. This conference will be held on September 3rd and 4th of next year, 2021, hopefully in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and if not, perhaps virtually, depending on this pandemic. Since we had already set this theme prior to the pandemic and the law enforcement and racial crisis in this country, our discussions leading up to the conference and the conference itself is very timely. Beginning in January, we plan to host one colloquy per month up to the time of the conference. We invite you to join us for our future sessions as well. You can visit our website for continual updates and look for the release for the call for papers sometimes this fall. You can also find other details, links, and videos about our conference theme on our website as well. We've already begun posting videos and readings for that conference. The URL for our website is www.ECCSSA.org, ECCSSA.org. We also recommend that you connect with us on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. This is where we post many updates, current research findings, relate to the public, related videos. We have lots of fun and much discussion there on pertinent issues. Probably our most detailed posts are on Facebook, which is a suitable platform for that purpose. We tend to be more active on Facebook, but we are placing announcements on all the other platforms as well. We invite you to find us and connect with us. We thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope you find the topic an informative one. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Sushma Shukla, who will introduce other members of our board of directors and the moderator for this evening's event. Dr. Shukla, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor King. Hello, everyone. I am Sushma Shukla. I'm an associate professor of economics at Piedmont, Virginia Community College and vice chair of the board of directors at ECCSSA. I would like to introduce the other board members. First, I will introduce Dr. Babita Srivastava. She is an adjunct professor of economics and business and co-researcher of the Cotsco College of Business at William Paterson University. Currently, she is serving as a secretary, board of directors at ECCSSA. Next, I will introduce Dr. Stanton Walton Green, professor emeritus and former dean of the McMurray School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Monmouth University in New Jersey. He is our newest member of the board of the directors. Dr. Green, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to welcome you all as well to the second in a series of colloquies that lead up to our annual conference next September. My name is Stan Green, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Monmouth University and a member of the board. I also want to thank all of you for attending and urge you to consider joining our organization as a member. Membership will give you discount on the conference registration and a free copy of our annual journal. If you're so inclined, I would further urge you to consider applying to become a member of our board of directors. Will you be able to lend your expertise and experience to the activities of our long-standing association, such as the planning of the conference, the editing of the journal, and the general administration of ECCSSA? You can learn more about us, as Dr. King has noted, on Facebook and Twitter and the website eccsa.org, where we post updates and videos of previous colloquies. One note on how we will proceed tonight. We hope that you will all consider asking questions or making comments after Dr. Greyson's presentation, which will be approximately 45 minutes. You can do so by using the Q&A function on your screen. Post your question there. We will call your name out and we will unmute you so that you can speak directly to Dr. Grayson or whomever you have the question for and be heard by all the attendees. Today's colloquy brings the renowned economic historian and racial justice activist, Dr. Walter Greason, to speak on race and economic history. In so doing, Dr. Greason will elucidate the historical and cultural context for the social unrest in which we are all living, and prescribe some remedies for closing the wealth gap. Current unrest derives in large part from the history of racism promulgated by European colonization, beginning in the late 15th century. European nations used their so-called quote-unquote discovery of North and South America, South Asia, and the Pacific to enslave Africans and subjugate, enslave, and decimate native communities. As an anthropologist, I have to admit, full disclosure, I am not proud to say that my discipline played a large role in this terrible period of human history. Among the first articles I read, in fact, as an undergraduate anthropology major, was by Kathleen Guff, entitled Anthropology and Imperialism, where Professor Guff laid out the foundational role of anthropology in helping Europeans colonize the world, most specifically by creating false biological hierarchical categories of race. Anthropologists laid out the rationalization for the slavery and genocide of so-called inferior races. Sociologist Ta-Nehisi Coates summarizes this profoundly by asserting that race is the child of racism and not the other way around. In other words, European white supremacy and racism created the concept of race as a means to categorize non-white communities as biologically and culturally inferior. Dr. Grayson has spent his career researching, writing, and speaking publicly about racial injustice, especially in terms of the economic marginalization of African American communities. His work is foundational to our understanding of why the economic wealth gap exists between white majority and African American minority communities. More than this, he has worked to apply his knowledge on how economies work to advocate for ways to close the wealth gap. Finally, I would be remiss not to mention his work as a master teacher, of which I have personally been part of. The students in his classes learn the skills to manage their own personal finances and build their own wealth and economic security. He is a man of theory, history, and action. Walter is currently chair of educational leadership of the School of Education at Monmouth University, where he is dean emeritus of the honors school and an associate professor of history. He has a BA from Villanova University and a doctorate from Temple University with a dissertation on suburbanization. His social justice work began with training by Ati Sumalo, Director General of KwaZulu-Natal under Nelson Mandela, and he has continued through projects with Maya Angelou, Cornel West, Toni Morrison, Desmond Tutu, Sonia Sanchez, and Amiri Baraka, and many others. During his career of nearly 30 years, he has used his interdisciplinary expertise to connect with faculty, students, and community leaders and politicians around the world to engage in global conversations and much more, and much more than this, even actions about democracy, capitalism, and digital markets that have sparked movements that have initiated social change. He has laser focused his action on vulnerable communities. Over the past decade, he has published 6 books whose titles give you a sense of the breadth of his expertise: Industrial Segregation, Cities Imagined, the African Diaspora in Media and History, Suburban Erasure, How Suburbanization Ended the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey, The Path to Freedom, Black Families in New Jersey, The Land Speaks, Encyclopedia of Black Comics, The American Economy, and Planning Future Cities. He has published over 100 academic papers spoken internationally, and appeared widely on the media, including Huffington Post, National Public Radio, and The Atlantic. His digital humanities projects, the Wakanda syllabus and the racial violence syllabus, have produced global responses. In the wake of the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, the racial violence syllabus attracted over 4 million individual uses, was translated into 7 languages, and inspired projects like the Oscar-winning film Black Klansman. The 2016 Wakanda syllabus defined Afrofuturism as one of the more core themes of media convergence and was a crucial element in the public acclaim that supported Marvel Studios' Oscar-winning feature film Black Panther. To the point of this presentation, Professor Greason's research is focused on comparative economic analysis of slavery, industrialization, suburbanization, and globalization since 1750, with a specific emphasis on using historic preservation, which to me as an archaeologist is particularly interesting, to lead reinvestment campaigns in small towns. Again, action, not just theory. Dr. Greason is the founding president of the T. Thomas Fortune Foundation, which led the restoration of the National Historic Landmark dedicated to the most militant journalist of the late 19th century, T. Thomas Fortune. I am so pleased to welcome my friend and colleague, Walter Greason, to offer his presentation entitled Race and Economic History, Violence and Profit. Thank you, Dr. Greason. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you all, Dean Green. My breath is taken away. I had to recover. That was a spectacular introduction. I will do my best to live up to how you have framed my work. I am just honored to be here with all of you today. The East Coast Colleges Social Science Association is an organization that brings together people who have such extraordinary expertise, but also reshape the discourse around the problems that face humanity. And so I am just so honored to be here with you all, and I hope I can raise a few questions and maybe offer a few tools to help us come up with better answers to the things that we struggle with in both our academic work and in public policy. And so to get into it, I have to tell a little bit about how I got into all of these areas, in that I am at Monmouth University. That is how Dean Green and I got associated. But I grew up in the area, and I had come back here in 2012 because my parents, my sister, were quite ill, and I needed to have a job close so I could help them through their elder years and to kind of get back on their feet. But my history at Monmouth goes back a good ways. It goes back into the mid-1980s, where I was taking computer science and mathematics courses as a young computer programmer. And that work kind of framed the way that I think about the questions. Like I've come to realize I think like a computer scientist, even as I go about doing historical research. And that training made me quite pragmatic about the ways that I want to find new data and the way that you organize it. That it's actually sadly funny. I was choosing between a path in education and a path in computer science. And my father said to me, well, the only way you can make money in computers is in hardware. You'll have to become an engineer and you'll need to build motherboards. And there is no real money in software. And so this was not the best piece of advice, but I kept up the kind of hobby of doing software design while I was doing my graduate work in history. And as the world turned, it became quite important to actually have these kinds of programming skills when it comes into a world where media and social media require that you communicate across various platforms. And that's been the heart of what I've done at Monmouth since I arrived on campus. They actually, Dean Green, Dr. Pearson was the provost, Dean Molliver in the School of Business, asked me to teach a history of American business and economic development course. And that is where most of the data you're going to see comes from. The history of business in the United States when I came to it, I had taught a similar course in previous years, but not as exclusively focused on those questions. But as I pulled the books together and began to kind of explore what was being taught, it was just striking to me over and over again that there was a kind of unspoken agreement not to teach slavery, that there was a way of starting the question with free labor and industrialization and commercial markets, and seeing slavery as a relic of the early modern period. And so that was troubling. And so I had this background in studying the transatlantic slave trade, and I wanted to get deeper into the economic analysis of the system and what people kind of dismissed as feudalism or mercantilism in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so in doing that and starting to raise those questions, I was very fortunate. I landed a position at Barnard College and Columbia University for 3 years while I was also working at Monmouth. And I worked with a team of researchers from all over the world to gather a huge amount of archaeological, anthropological, and economic data to look at the way the world economy had evolved. And so processing the data has taken some time, but the classes I taught at Monmouth helped tremendously with that. And so what I wanted to share with you all today, for the first time probably since before I published American Economy, so probably 2014 is the last time I did a talk of this kind of scope that the abstract indicates. That material looks at colonization, enslavement, and the ways that the transformation of modern markets in that period set the template for what would become both industrialization and globalization. And I'm going to look at that in 6 particular cases. These 6 cases came from a grant that I received from the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2016, when we were working on developing digital platforms to communicate traditional humanities and social science content. And so a lot of what you'll see in the material came out of the skills that I gained with the NEH, Office of Digital Humanities. And so I look forward to your responses and critique, but I do ask for your patience. This is not something that fits into any one category very neatly. And it is something that has been in the process for some time. And I'll get a little more into that once I have the slides show up. So can I share a document for everyone's screen yet?
Yes. Stop sharing screen. Show screen. Stop sharing screen. Change presenter.
All right, so let's make sure I have what I need here. Can you all see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, so it says race and economic history, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as an introduction, just to lay the foundations for this, this is a mixed methods approach designed to address not just Marxian critics, but also the kind of consensus of business and economic historians about the way the world economy has changed, especially since 1750. That's the core of what I hope to share with you all in the next few minutes. In particular, there are a couple ways I go about this as both quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis. And I'll get to it in some detail a couple slides in. But the ways that we have assumed the importance of GDP in particular, and I was glad to see in the last couple of years, major central bankers are beginning to recognize that GDP is no longer as descriptive of economic performance as it has been assumed to have been for the last 70 or 80 years. And we're beginning to look for more critical tools to understand economic change and development across different kinds of national and regional variations. That's what I hope to kind of accomplish with the set of tools I'm going to put on the table tonight, particularly to correct what a colleague of mine at Ohio State, Trevon Logan, has called the misunderstanding of race and racism within the economics profession that he's hoping, and now I'm working with various branches of the Federal Reserve banking system to improve the way that economics, financial institutions, the core of our macroeconomic principles actually address longstanding poverty, trends of poverty and deprivation. And I come at this largely as an urban historian, seeing the effects of real estate, I would say is my main entry point. That when I saw the ways that poverty and segregation were reinforced by real estate policy and financial underwriting of real estate policy, that's what led me into the analysis you're about to see. So let's go. This has been 25 years of work on this question. My initial inquiry came with teaching courses at both Temple and Drexel universities. And I would ask economists, okay, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about inequality, we're looking at variations down to the neighborhood or municipal level. How much money is really out there? What are we all kind of politically negotiating over access to? And I asked that question for a decade, from 1994 or 5 until about 2005, 2006. And there was never a straight answer. Even the concept of a global market cap was beyond most of my colleagues' ability to kind of really pin down and fix. And I was fascinated with the question because if I didn't know the size of the entire portrait, if I didn't know the details of how wealth operated, then it was much more difficult to talk about solutions. And so finally, it was Sir Partha Dasgupta published a report for the United Nations in 2012 that started to give me some answers. And that led to a series of what I've produced now are infographics that explore economic development over the last 200 years, back to 1800, and what has happened in different nations and different cities as a result of very specific policy interventions at different points in time. And so that's where we get something like this. This is just a sample infographic about Texas in 1860. And I'm going to focus on a little bit about, when we have these for the entire South, how did the enslavement of Africans in the early 19th century create a set of structures that influenced the way we understand free markets in the 20th century. So in the larger website that we're going to release, I have a new publication coming out in a couple months. We look at the idea of the Spanish imperial economy during the 16th and 17th centuries. Very important questions that very few English-speaking scholars really get into. And this is one of the representations of it, of the data, is a visualization about the nature of the Spanish imperial economy over those 2 centuries, and then how different it was in the 1700s and 1800s and 1900s. That process begins to set the table about, it's not an unchecked story of progress. That often is what happens in business and economic history courses, is that, you know, industrialization, globalization are largely positive trends that lead to improvements in human standards of living. I do attempt to kind of invert that and say, well, there were some things that were lost along the way that were quite important. And so the Mexican infographic is just one place to start. We also have a really good one on Canada. And then I'll close with making some references to the impact on the Caribbean as well. But this process of changing and being critical of our standard narrative is the opening exercise. This has been the heart of what my courses have been about. And so this was the initial infographic that led to the publication of American Economy, and a lot of the conversations that emerged from 2014 to 2016 about what's now called the new history of capitalism. I tend to call this field the social history of capitalism. It's a little bit more accurate about the methodology and the preparation of the major writers who have taken these questions on. But once I had Dasgupta's data on social capital and the nature of national assets across the world, I could create this simple visualization about how much total capital investment had gone into different parts of the world that were the major kind of centers of economic development. How did that happen in the early 21st century? And so this is where I'd want to talk a little bit about framework and methodology. I come at this through the lens of world history. Peter Gran was an enormous influence on my graduate studies. And so his work led me to Emanuel Wallerstein and the historical sociology of world systems, that we were seeing the ways regional parts of the world were evolving, whether we consider the Silk Road in the medieval period, you go back to the importance of the Eastern Mediterranean in the ancient world. These questions have been around and have been debated for decades, but Wallerstein provided an entry point and let me start to see the larger patterns and how they began to evolve. In particular, it was Dasgupta's econometric analysis of social capital that was just the key I had been missing for a long time. And it was his calculation of the asset value of the top 20 largest economies for the United Nations that then set the table for me to start to look at, okay, how would I break that data down for every country based on the 2010 data? How would I then begin to figure out what were the changes going backwards in time? How could I historicize Dasgupta's data? And so that was the major breakthrough in the first 2 years at Columbia, was a way of depreciating national assets that were pretty well agreed upon between 2000 and 2010, but began to look back at the surviving evidence about the national wealth of these different countries back to 1750, as you began to look at systems of empire and consolidation of wealth, the expansion of wealth, and the damage that it did in many vulnerable communities. That required a great deal of work that took almost 5 years of having 50 different researchers dig through historical economic data, anthropological data, historical data, archaeological evidence, and we ended up being able to create what we call asset maps. They're essentially Excel files that track the amount of money in constant dollars that each empire in every nation invested by decade, and then how it grew or how it collapsed. And so all of this material is now up online, and I hope to share the link at the end of the evening so that everybody can take a look. But this solved my initial problem, my frustration for the first decade about the nature of the world economy and what we were competing for, like what were we debating as a policy matter. This was the figure that came out of that initial few years of work, was that by 2015, around the world is approximately $423 trillion of investment that had taken place over the previous decade. And so that set the table for us to then begin to figure out how to look backwards. Once we knew what the total pool was, then we could start to figure out how the pool had changed going back a decade, several decades, centuries, at least back to the early, 18th century was really where I was most confident about what we were talking about. So the next piece was about slavery, or the better term I've been using recently is enslavement, is the process of taking a human being and reducing them to property on a scale that was unprecedented by the early 18th century, and then just expanded dramatically after that point. And so that process led us to this story about Canada. And that was one of the kind of surprising early features for me. was reimagining the North American continent as an economy in the early 18th century. And as an Americanist, going back into the colonial period is a challenge enough to see the world quite differently from the context of European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. But then to find Afua Cooper, and I will own up front here on the recording, her daughter was one of the students. She didn't take my class at Columbia, but she was friends with my students. And then as we were talking about these questions, she became interested. And in working with her daughter, I learned about Afua Cooper's work and got to read The Hanging of Angelique for the first time. And it just opened a door to understand a key point that Walter Johnson at Howard had suggested in the late 1990s, is that we were missing the point in the way that we understood the process of enslavement. Enslavement was not about the agricultural production of sugar or tobacco or cotton. Those were all tremendously important, but they were not the core of what was happening in the process of commercial development and in his case, he's focusing on the early 19th century in the American South. It is the legal and conceptual impact of human beings as currency that comes forward in The Hanging of Angelique. And in this case, we're looking at Montreal around 1721. And it's a story of an African woman held as property and acting in concert with other people, both indentured laborers and other enslaved Africans, to overturn the abuses that they were suffering. And in Montreal, it was not about their productive capacity to grow cash crops. It was the monetary value that enslaved Africans held that were used as a way to barter and to exchange, and when you didn't have a standard form of currency in a settler colonial context. And so Angelique ultimately is convicted of the burning of old Montreal. That was a wider conspiracy that Cooper settles on the idea that it was her European conspirator that was much more responsible for the actual burning, but she was caught, and it was her defiance that had to be punished. And so even in a place where the agricultural productive capacity of enslavement was limited, like Montreal, the key of exchanging Africans and indigenous people as currency was at the center of what made the settlement prosper. It allowed it to set up a kind of standard military installation. It set up the church as the initial banking infrastructure in the city. And so this begins to reveal some of the internal social and commercial processes of a colony in the early 18th century, and opened up new understanding for me of the Western Hemisphere. So the second piece of this is then to look back across the Atlantic at where the product of the triangle trade had its greatest impact. And in doing this work, I came to focus on Liverpool, which was the largest center for the slave trade in Great Britain through the 18th century to the start of the 19th century. And it's astonishing when you start to look at the archaeological and urban design history of Liverpool over that century. It was a prosperous center. The mercantile system had established and created an infrastructure that was profitable. But the expansion of the slave trade after 1720 just revolutionized the city of Liverpool and made it a global metropole, a place that had reach on a global scale by the time we get to 1800. And I was just flabbergasted as the math played out that comparatively to the cities, the colonies of the transatlantic system, Liverpool had grown to $20 billion in current funding by 1800. It was a dramatic. I think it was over 800% growth in less than 60 years, and so you saw very rapidly that even without enslavement being legal on the ground in Britain, the wages of the violence of slavery built roads and canals. And this particular map comes from an animation that I have available on YouTube that talks about the development of the dock system and where kind of the shipping was held, where the initial auction site was, how close in proximity for even offloading and assessing before shipping out to another location. This third location was what happened by 1830, was you have the initial customs house. So the system of taxing, assessing, and establishing multiple currencies in terms of global imperial trade happening at this site. And then fourth was then the initial railroad line that was introduced here to ship to the interior of England, out towards London and to the eastern coast. And so the historical mapping of Liverpool talked about the importance of enslavement in setting the foundation for infrastructure development. And that model is enormously powerful over the 19th century. That connection of using a trade in human beings to then financially underwrite infrastructure is what really begins to connect to what Partha Dasgupta does with his analysis of social capital. And to really dig into that, there are a number of English-speaking American cities that I focus on, but Philadelphia, probably because I went to Temple and Villanova, was a place where I could dig out a lot of information very, very quickly. And so this is a portrait of William Still, who was the architect of the Underground Railroad in the 1840s and 1850s, sponsoring Harriet Tubman, probably most famously. And so Still, as a Philadelphian, is one of the most important and least studied figures in understanding the way a free and open market can evolve. And it's astonishing to me because even as Pennsylvania abolished slavery prior to the end of the American Revolution, the implicit commitment to racial violence, to racism as a governing practice remained in force. That by 1820, Pennsylvania had restricted land ownership rights, business ownership rights, the ability for people of African descent, even if legally free, to participate in the way that the economy was growing. And I look at the case of William Still in particular, this man who built this extraordinary secretive enterprise that dramatically disrupted the way the system of enslavement operated in Delaware and Maryland and Northern Virginia, with no public backing. There was no legal structure or financial underwriting to make the Underground Railroad work, or any of the publications that he put forth to serve a free Black community. The Black churches existed as kind of illicit enterprises that were on the margins of an open and free economy. Most notably, we looked at the 1834 Flying Horses race riot in Philadelphia, where the Black populations free in Southern Philadelphia, in Moyamensing and Southwark, were decimated by interpersonal violence that went unpunished by the legal system. That cost that community, in modern terms, $20 million. Now, $20 million macroeconomically doesn't sound large, but in 1830, in a developing marketplace, that was the difference between being able to participate in the early forms of industrialization that would have put a massive dent in the kinds of racial wealth gaps that we study today. And so William Still is one of these cases where he's not at all studied within the context of business and economic history, but he really should be in the context of the arguments we make about the importance of an open commercial market and why that was a superior system to what we had seen in terms of racial enslavement. I have a couple additional slides just about the analysis piece here, and I'll try to make it so that we can all see everything. This piece is the key to looking at the 18th and 19th centuries and the role of enslavement, and as an economic and commercial phenomenon. And it is the main piece that I put at the center of American economy, that we often underestimate the ways that Africans were both quote unquote natural resources as livestock, that their children became kind of new forms of money in these systems, and their physical infrastructure impact in terms of clearing land and building roads, performing any number of kinds of manufacturing activities, in addition to the agricultural impacts that they had. Under Partha Dasgupta's system, only free African Americans, people who had gained their freedom, could be counted as human capital based on their education and level of commercial expertise. And so those three categories of natural resources, physical infrastructure, and human capital, and the relationships between them, these are really important for us to get a better handle on as we look at historical world systems economic development. It's the key to the asset maps that we've generated. But even as we look forward and deal with the 21st century, I think this is going to hopefully spark us to have better understandings of what we're doing in the world marketplace today. I did include this brief image just because so many people never think about the role of slavery as a commercial system in the Northeast. And so we see this as Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. This is Long Island, with a heavy concentration, as 32% of the local population in, Brooklyn, was actually enslaved Africans in 1798. And this sets up an entire dynamic of selling enslaved Africans out of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic into Maryland and Virginia, that then underwrites the way road systems are created, the way canals are created. And so that's one specific piece we can get deeper into in questions and answers. This data lets us ask much more specific questions about enslavement at the state and local level, and then track the way that it had this impact in building what we consider free markets in the 19th century. And that sets up what happens with industrialization. And so there's an enormous piece here that's a separate talk on the impact of Victorian England and the way that the American Civil War plays out. But I want to get past that to little focus on larger themes that connect us to what we're living today. And so at the heart of this is this transition from 1880 to 1950, where the scope and scale of industrialization just escapes anything that the world had ever seen prior. That the ability to develop and create systems of exchange, of profitability at the local and the regional scale, completely redefines the Midwestern United States, the Great Lakes region of the United States, Western New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, even into Minnesota and Iowa. That region, Wisconsin, I always forget. This region is entirely reinvented. And from a social and economic perspective, the redesign of the economic system across that region has been studied in great detail, but not with this kind of perspective, not looking particularly at the patterns and connections of how the region became the center of the world economy by the middle of the 20th century. And particularly as we look at the two world wars, this is absolutely essential to understand the way that those conflicts played out. And so this particular illustration is based on the asset map of Illinois, where if you look back at what was happening with even the most prosperous state economies based in enslavement by the Civil War, any of even the smallest Midwestern industrial economies are 100 times larger. For instance, I can say off the top of my head, Mississippi and Alabama were both $9 billion economies at the start of the Civil War based on their use of enslaved Africans. Chicago alone, on the brink of the Second World War, is almost a $500 billion economy. And so the processes of how we manage our financial infrastructure and create capital changes in fundamental ways over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century. And so at the heart of this, and for folks familiar with the literature, I have a lot of business and economic folks on this line, it's this federal investment in national physical infrastructure that transforms the region, transforms the nation. And my students are always going through this part of the class and saying, I had no idea banks and coal and oil and railroads and steel were all as important as they were. And even within that, they're still even more flabbergasted at the way that we kind of globalized textile production in a way that hadn't been done previously. So it's that way that a stronger federal government creates multiple sectors that we're now completely familiar with today, that we take for granted, that we watch the way different markets perform. But this is all an invention of especially the 1880s and 1890s in the United States. And that the major feature is the Interstate Commerce Act that begins the process of managing railroad development and consolidating state and regional markets into a national system. The one example the students always are blown away by is the idea of time zones, that you get the idea that you have to sync up schedules so that you have reliable shipping transit across the continent. So the differences between East Coast time and Central or Mountain time and Pacific time, all of that, the concept of time itself is no longer local. It's now has to be national in order for these systems to work. And so industrialization completely changes our conceptual framework of what an economy is and how it operates. And there's lots of other rules. The accounting system is another major change. But all of this is essentially a financial leverage play where these regional economies, especially in New York State and in Pennsylvania, they prioritize the construction of infrastructure as a capital multiplier. That when you have, early in the 19th century, an Erie Canal to provide a faster route across North America, that's what underwrites the ability to create this kinds of regional system. That initial phase of creating new infrastructure is best symbolized by the thousands and thousands of miles of railroad that are constructed in this period. But most importantly, after 1920, and this is where Dasgupta's work is most profound, is that it's human capital. It's the level of education and it's the expertise of the population that then decides the degree of economic success for the remainder of the 20th century. So once infrastructures are in place, you can continue to improve on them, most notably with something like the interstate highway system or the way that our air traffic operates. These things are all very important, but you need a highly educated, highly skilled population to make the most of it and to grow new enterprise within this structure. Yet at the heart of it, we see in places like Chicago that the economic order that emerges still relies on the commitment to racial violence to keep some people on the outside looking in. And often it is Black populations, indigenous populations, immigrant populations generally, that there are going to be discrete and clear winners of the industrial order that benefit from these waves of massive industrialization, massive urbanization that unfold across the country. But the core habit of who gets the benefit and why remains a relic of what had been in the 18th and 19th century. And so I did skip one slide to go back, is that as we look across the landscape, instead of what had been a decentralized rural and agricultural system in the 19th century in terms of the standard of wealth creation, industrial urbanization creates these massive cities, even metropolitan centers, these places that are sprawling for hundreds of square miles. They become the symbol of macroeconomic efficiency. Chicago is by far the most well-studied, but New York and Los Angeles as well. And those all set the template for what we now look at when we see the booming nature of a Vancouver economy, or if you look around what's happened in Beijing or Tokyo. These places are all kind of using the blueprint of what happened in North America between 1880 and 1950. The piece that drew me in for this particular subject, and I have been going for a little while, so I'm going to try to speed up some, is what happens in New Jersey. And so we see the metropolitan effect of what happens with New York is that the city itself begins to spawn smaller urban centers, most notably Newark, just across the Hudson River. But then you have smaller urban centers, New Brunswick or Princeton, Long Branch, since we have a couple of Monmouth University folks in the room, Trenton, Camden, Atlantic City. New Jersey, and then Camden in particular, is just across the river from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, becomes a connecting region between two major metropolitan centers. And scholars in the 70s and 80s, sociologists, call this a megalopolis, that there are two large cities that connect, and then in their connection, develop these dormitory or residential suburbs that contain the population that works in industry related to what's happening in the urban centers. And the brilliant piece that I owe to a colleague at the University of Maryland named David Freund, he talks about the ways that both violence and economics after 1950 reinforce the historic patterns of racial oppression, racial segregation. He talks about the ways that the riot or the lynching is no longer the key facet. In fact, it gets incorporated into patterns of law enforcement. But then beyond that, it's made into a nonviolent barrier strictly through systems like redlining, where people are not allowed to borrow based upon the neighborhood they live in. And so there's a kind of invisible barrier that people who are impoverished or working class or lower middle class will never realize that they can't get access to the resources that someone in a neighboring community or a few miles away can get into. And so New Jersey is a great model for this. California is also good. I just read a book on Texas and how Texas is following this model of metropolitan formation. But what strikes me most is that in the 21st century, China has embraced this model. A lot of my colleagues in architecture and urban planning are aggressively working in the Far East, in China and Japan and Korea, Vietnam, to bring this model of regionalization into the way those economies are developing. And so that takes us to what globalization is. And it is this way of developing a wide range of diverse markets to participate in systems of international trade in ways that in theory are advantageous to everyone who participates. And so for this piece, I did something new, something that was not a part of what the data set was at Columbia. This just took me the last 3 or 4 weeks to start to put together what was happening. But Mumbai, India presents a great case for how this globalization is transforming South Asia specifically. And instead of these patterns of specific white versus black violence that are the core of North American and United States history, these patterns of religion and caste are shaping these kinds of spatial disparities in Mumbai, where and I have to thank Shariah Jain is the person who wrote this particular planning report. But historic Island City District here the oldest parts of Mumbai. The newer suburbs that have grown as populations have moved closer and closer and started to develop transportation systems, rail lines and highways that move people back and forth commuting through the region. And then the outer lying kind of ex-urban or peri-urban region that are rural areas gradually over time converting into suburbs as the infrastructure grows out to meet them. And then the more isolated places that are certainly more rural, but within 20 to 30 years will follow this same pattern. And so Mumbai already is over 200 square miles, I believe is the largest city in India, and over 20 million people in the city. That this is a place that is worth $20 trillion of investment over the last decade to service the kinds of urban concentration that are happening in the region. And this is small. This sounds like a large number today. But just like I said, the $20 million lost when the Black neighborhoods in Philadelphia were destroyed, this 20 trillion in 20 years, certainly in 50 years, will look like a pittance, will look like a very small investment in the way that the world economy is continuing to change. And so this is what globalization is. It has become this process of replicating patterns of social, cultural, and economic exclusion based on the ability to participate in the financial and economic systems of creating new industries. And that's what I hope we can start to engage and transform in the decade ahead. In fact, I'm already doing this work in a number of places, but it's hard, and we need more people kind of getting on board with the agenda. And so I use another reference to North America to kind of transform it, and then I would guess Dean Green might recognize what I'm about to do here. But this is a map of North America. This is Alaska, the West Coast, Baja California, Mexico, down to Central America, the Caribbean, Florida, up through Nova Scotia. This is an indigenous map of what scholars of American Indians prior to European contact call Turtle Island. And the colored areas were the places where different groups of indigenous Americans organized their societies. And it's essentially documenting what was lost and what was, for thousands of years, a sustainable system of the way these people lived. And so what I've found in really horrendous terms as I've done the work is that I track the way that the Caribbean economies and further south into the northern parts of South America have been left behind in the 19th century in terms of regional exploitation. That the economies of the Caribbean and to a certain extent rural parts of Mexico are not able to escape the patterns that took hold in the 18th and 19th centuries, that slavery and segregation still define much of what is possible on a daily basis, and that the infrastructure of the 20th century and 21st century has not come to bear fruit in these places. And I think if you look across much of rural India, Southeast Asia, and China, you would find similar kinds of results. And so the answer is not so much how do we emulate and build more versions of New York City and Chicago, more Tokyos and Beijings, but how do we actually preserve and render these smaller rural places with greater dignity that preserves both sustainability and indigenous autonomy? Those are the kinds of questions I'm engaged with. Those are the things I wanted to come and share with you all tonight. And I'm eager to hear from all of you about your own expertise and insights about all of this. Thank you for giving me a few minutes, and I will take down the share screen. And let's see if I can figure out how to stop showing screen, change presenter.
All right.
And we'll go back. Rosalind was managing everything, so I'll go there. So thank you all. I'm going to get a hold of the link as well and try to share that in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay, a lot of things to chew on there. I have a billion questions, but I'm going to, before I ask any of mine, I wanted to know, especially since we have a couple of economists among us, um, whether anybody else on the board has a question. I don't know what I did here. Something happened here.
Sorry.
There we go. Sushma, Babita, Rosalind, do you have any questions of Dr. Greason right off?
I'll yield to the audience first, to the attendees, but I have several.
Okay, start it off then.
Okay, so in listening to the presentation, I had several. One was, how did slavery influence the way we understand the 21st century? If you could summarize that, that is one. How did enslavement pan out in Liverpool and other countries? That would be important to know. What happened precisely? What is the comparison, comparing African slavery, African slaves in the United States to white indentured servants? What's the difference in the contribution to profit? And will the US ever admit that profit was produced from slavery, other than a few distinct scholars who are looking at that? So that can get you started.
Yes,
That'll get-
indeed.
Take them however you want, Walter.
Yes, indeed. So I'll start with the first, the particular ways that enslaved Africans were monetized, and that's kind of that early concept. Is that is a great story in Walter Johnson's book Soul by Soul about the ways slave traders moving by foot a group of 10 or 20 enslaved Africans from Virginia to North Carolina and ultimately Georgia were extended credit at multiple stops to be repaid along their journey because they were carrying money, like they were literally transporting money from one place to another. So when you see this group of people, people were happy to see them in town because it meant that there was going to be some level of exchange, some level of profitability that was happening. And in fact, at the point of departure, these journeys were often insured. And so the local financial institutions would assess how much profit they expected to make along the journey and then decide to kind of charge the person who was providing the enslaved Africans how much they would charge him to insure against loss. And so in a system that has only local, not even really state banking infrastructures, it was just astonishing to see how enslaved Africans were the most stable and reliable form of currency. How is that different from indentured servants? Typically, they didn't have the same rates of insurance. Prior to 1670, you didn't have any of these kinds of institutions. It was much more barter oriented. And so their children weren't potential money in the same way. And so while also exploited, while also treated quite badly, they're just the level of objectification did not become financialized, did not become a way for folks to render as abstract capital. And so those are the biggest kind of differences I saw there. And then these larger questions of a few scholars talking about the national acknowledgement. I have been working for a long time. I mean, you know, from the days of working with the folks on ending apartheid in South Africa on these kinds of questions of national recognition and how does someone build an inclusive national economy. And we still see South Africa struggle mightily with this, you know, 25 years later. The way that we have to see the United States in this current moment is that there has never been as broad a consensus and as much scholarly evidence to demonstrate the profitability of these kinds of systems of exploitation and the way that they've sustained and evolved over centuries. I remember when Thomas Shapiro, Melvin Oliver first came out with the analysis of wealth versus income in the late 90s. And that just broke the door on saying, oh, there's this whole level of inequality we've not even spoken about for 50 years. And so that led to one of the guys I work with is William Darity, he's an economist down at Duke. And he has a new book out called From Here to Equality that's focused explicitly on the racial wealth gap. And there is a current fight going into next year's legislative session at Congress, not just to study reparations, but to talk about what are the ways to deliver them. So I think back to Randall Robinson in the days after the attempt to make an apartheid-free South Africa. He spoke first about the scale of the economic damage that had been done. Now I think we have a better vocabulary for talking about the gains that were made for the people who participated in the exploitation as well. It's not just about loss, it's about particular places that benefited. So there are places that have become extraordinarily wealthy. New York at probably the top of the list alongside London. But now we have a way to look at those gains and kind of trouble the way that they have to be kind of shared. I just saw an article a friend of mine published in The Guardian that talked about we have to stop talking about how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but we should understand how did Africa overdevelop Europe. And so those are the kinds of conversations I just didn't see as possible 30 years ago.
That's very interesting. Let me just, before we keep moving on, encourage anybody, any of the participants, any of the attendees to ask questions. I wanted to pull, since you mentioned the wealth gap and also built on Rosalind's question, and you laid out basically the legacy of the wealth gap and the basically through enslavement, industrialization, globalization, the consolidation of wealth, the marginalization of immigrants, Africans, whatever, in whatever context, the various contexts in Australia, maybe the Aboriginal populations. The history is full of questions, and you gave us some great references on this. But I'm wondering your thoughts in terms of moving forward. And let me give you some. I've had some conversations. I'm involved in groups that are trying to develop the green economy and the incredible potential that if we move in the right direction in our federal government, and I know that the Senate and the Congress and politicians and policymakers are thinking this way, that there's tremendous opportunity for growth. I don't know if you thought about this, Walter, but is there a way of tying that, the opportunity that lies in front of us in terms of energy, economy, green economy, and how it mitigate, and all the things we have to do in terms of dealing with the potential problem of climate change, in terms of shrinking or mitigating that wealth gap by giving people that have not, for example, been able to develop wealth via real estate, for example, opportunities to grow with a kind of what some people are calling the Internet of Things, or the new revolution, the new economic revolution, or whatever. Do you see what I'm saying? Have you thought about how we can close that gap with some opportunities that may actually exist?
Yes, absolutely. No, that's been one of the things I've focused on. I want to say probably starting around 2004. I worked with a small community in Philadelphia to essentially start to do at the state level energy efficiency, underwriting energy efficiency, so that more people could have a smaller carbon footprint in suburban Philadelphia. And that proved really effective. Governor Ed Rendell adopted it. There were a number of benefits that kind of transformed the way what are generally really energy inefficient suburban areas into places where people share transit, and they were given benefits to go and make more green energy for their homes, solar energy for their homes, water collection so that they were less taxing on the public water system. those things then led to what was the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and the Obama administration's attempt to start us down a path towards green energy and sustainability on a national scale. And of course, we've taken several steps back from that since 2012. But I do think the track record for us to move in that direction, whether it's specifically the legislation of the Green New Deal, or if it's something even more ambitious on a global scale among G20 partners to really just say we're going to make a more sustainable standard in our housing and industrial codes. There's a huge opportunity that we have right now in the next 2 years to create a framework that our grandchildren will thank us for. And so this is one of the big stakes that we have coming up in the next couple hours with the debate and in the next couple weeks with an election. But it's not even just what happens in North America. It's got to happen across Europe. It's got to be a confrontation with the way that China is industrializing. And so I think there's enormous work for us to do that, yes, turns us towards a sustainable future based upon a number of practices that underdeveloped or neglected communities can lead and really benefit from.
That's what I was going to, you answered my follow-up, which is that when you say sustainability, you also mean decentralizing and sharing of the resources and sharing of the wealth.
Yes, a lot of my expertise is in running cooperatives for food, clothing, shelter, energy distribution. So there are so many lessons we need to learn where it's not just everybody earning the most that they can and just hoarding whatever they can lay their hands on. We've got to really abandon that.
Okay, and I have another question related to that, and I know that you're looking at the historical aspects of most of this, but have you thought about the comparisons to today in the 21st century with the same population of people, and comparing and contrasting the profits that were made during slavery versus what's going on right now? That's a big one. And have you
Yes.
any thought to that, or do you have a plan to look at that? Because where have we come from in terms of what progress has been made? Not a lot.
That's one of the scariest things. And I've been kind of back and forth with Columbia University Press on a manuscript about specifically what's happened since 1960. But in American economy, the fourth chapter is all on globalization. And at the heart of it is the theme of consumerism, that essentially people who are trained from a very early age through television or radio to buy consumer goods just habitually, almost without the ability to stop. That consumerism is what is driving a lot of the really dangerous unsustainability globally, and we're using it again as a model to build up middle classes around the world that just continually demand more and more products that feed comfort and entertainment. And it's not healthy. It just in the United States and in Western Europe, it fuels obesity, it drives up healthcare costs. The way I see consumers treated in the last 20 to 30 years are, I won't say similar to the way people were enslaved, but we have accepted as consumers a set of chains on our social behaviors, on our sense of how we use our time, that we think we have choice, but we really don't. And so small things like having a smart speaker in your home, where you think it's really fun to play with Alexa and, you know, order something that'll show up in your door the next day, there's a monitoring device. Like, it is listening to you and gathering and selling your data for enormous profits for a man that's worth $100 billion. Those kinds of things, when you really look at what kind of freedom you want to enjoy, as consumers, we've given away such enormous freedoms. Just, I mean, I do a lot of stuff around food, and the access to the kinds of foods that are healthy for us, it's just ridiculously hard, let alone environmental protections. And so we're not shackled and whipped on a daily basis the same kind of violence that was prevalent in the 18th century is not the dominant mode that most of humanity experiences anymore. But there's this kind of subtle, pernicious violence. I've seen scholars talk about it in terms of being the frog in the boiling water. You don't really jump out because it's not really hot at the beginning, but by the time you feel the heat, it's too late. You're already cooked. And so this is what I see happening with the global reliance on consumerism.
Doesn't consumerism also require minimizing labor costs, essentially enslaving people or indenturing people, and dangerous kind of mining and things like that? So I know you're talking about you're talking about enslaving the consumers, but in order to buy that cheap stuff at Walmart or through Amazon, the producers are still, they're the marginalized suburbs or whatever you want to, they're the marginalized groups. Am I right in thinking?
And that's the really nasty trade-off, is that you have folks in rural parts of the developing world who can earn much more than they could attempting to live a preferred lifestyle in a rural area that's more traditional. But then at the same time, what they're trading away is, essentially their freedom of their own scheduling. Like, they may make more and they can send more currency home, but they're doing extraordinarily dangerous work that can shorten their lifespans and generally do it for a system that cares very little and does not want to see them have any kind of quality of life in the long term. So no, you're absolutely right. Like, you see some of the poisonous and abusive stuff that happens in factories. I think about Brazil, and there's just horrendous human rights abuses that's the cost of what happens to help their market grow. And it's not designed for human dignity or human rights.
Right.
Are you aware of the fact that China has a strategic plan to eradicate poverty in their country in the coming decade?
And I'm always interested in the calculation of how they figure out what the eradication of poverty is. And so I'm always a little suspicious of state calculations. I'd like to see the way independent voices look at what's happening for, like, I'm sure relative to rural farming poverty in China, folks will do much better. Does that mean that they're actually going to live a life of autonomy, 3-day work week, lots of leisure time with enormous amounts of disposable income to kind of retire early? I suspect not.
Would that be the case here? We don't even have a strategic plan in the United States to eradicate poverty from particular groups of people. At least they have a discussion and a strategic plan where they're trying to do that, and they're elevating their people with education, even at the lower class levels.
Oh no, I don't mean to argue for the United States system at all. Don't take me as saying that. I think we generally have a global consensus among folks governing that's very scary about the life quality of most of humanity. When we're celebrating Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand as a kind of global leader for what's possible, we're in a tough spot, because New Zealand is a small country that does not really pull anybody along with their decision making. But when you look at the G20 generally, there's not the same concern. I mean, I guess Canada, I guess Germany, you have the EU trying to find some ways forward, but we need to reverse the course we've been on, not just for a decade, but for probably 3 or 4 decades.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Do we have any other questions from our board or any participants? Give you a chance to think for a second. I think we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. Well, I'm going to ask a question, which is, you mentioned Randall Robinson, and I don't know if you were to use the word reparations, but do you think there's a systemic way of doing reparations? In other words, distributing or allowing people to grow wealth, giving them through opportunities, we talk about economic opportunity zones. I'm sure you're an urban planner. I don't know, you know what that's all about or what it's not really about. What's your sense as the person who has the incredible broad economic and historic context for all this in terms of repairing the wealth gap? Is there a way of repairing it? Is there an actual form of reparations that, at least in maybe the US, can help us move forward a little bit?
Yeah, William Darity and I fight about this probably every month online. He and I come back and forth and disagree about the nature of it. He is committed, and he has an extraordinary formula for federal systemic reparations that goes into schooling, that goes into repairing the way neighborhoods have lost value, that talks about financial education and does enterprise creation. His is the most ambitious structural way to intervene by a federal government to repair decades of discrimination and oppression. It's just an astonishing framework. My critique that he always jumps on me and says, you're asking for too much, which is crazy because he's asking for like $16 trillion. And so he's like, yeah, no, we can't do yours. Yours is too expensive. And what I talk about is economic autonomy. I don't want people to have to choose to participate in an economic system that they have no interest in, that they feel doesn't serve them. And so instead of looking at trying to raise the standard of people moving into emulating Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, I'm much more interested in people having the flexibility to kind of set the own terms for their own lives and set opportunities for their families to choose on their own terms. And that's in one way at the individual scale much cheaper and can sound more conservative. But to defend people's individual autonomy is an extraordinary commitment in a world where everything is networked and you require. Walmart has 2 million employees globally. Like, you know, these systems of profit are built around lots of people choosing to give up large portions of their freedom. And so to try and turn that back into smaller enterprise and more economic independence is ridiculously hard. And so in that sense, it's my approach is a little bit more radical, and it's not as easy as trying to move a state or a federal government to act.
Right. So more of a small is beautiful approach, maybe, Schumacher. Decentralization. I mean, that gives me a little bit of hope that, especially with regard to we have about a 30-year window, in my opinion, in terms of the climate situation. And I can see that as a 30-year opportunity if we go the decentralized way. For example, strengthening the grid, not by getting people to work for New Jersey Power, but by allowing them to solarize their homes. You know this side of me. I'm still playing that song, and it's very difficult, but that gives them the autonomy and the freedom to live their lives the way they want to and where they want to. I just thought I do want to ask you one question before I give everybody one more chance, which is, okay, I'll put you on the spot here, Walter. For those of us who want to read one of your books to get rolling in terms of your general approach to this, kind of the most accessible, maybe, I don't know, foundational, what would it be? The American Economy, or to be one of your other books?
Good question. So this is a distinguished group of scholars, so I would not hold back on that. It's really the combination of two of the more recent books. It's Planning Future Cities and Industrial Segregation. So if you're more interested in the 19th century, it's Industrial Segregation. If you're more interested in the 20th century, it's Planning Future Cities.
Planning Future Cities. Okay. That's great. Everybody write that down. Anybody else have any final comments?
Yeah, you ask folks to choose between their kids, man. Like that's a tough thing. Which book? I'd like them all, man.
That way, it's sort of like choosing your favorite child, right? Or your favorite parent or whatever. But I'm not saying you stop there, but I'm saying where do you start? That's what I'm saying.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And I've toyed with that So
I think it's mostly 20th century folks on the call, maybe a couple other historians, but like 20th century is planning future cities. That gets at both the structures and what they did well in terms of industrialization, what they missed, and then the costs of what they missed, and then what we can possibly do better going forward.
Perfect. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
I did post the question in the chat for the audience to see. This is their last opportunity to ask a question. We're happy to unmute you and allow you to turn on your webcam if you want to have pose a question to Dr. Greason or any of us. Please feel free now to do that before we adjourn. So all you need to do is, I guess, raise your hand, and I'm happy to turn the mic over to you. See anybody? Okay, so Patrick O'Halloran says, thanks for your perspective, very well argued and thoughtful, thanks. Patrick, would you like us to unmute you?
And Dr. Asaya said, the notion of asset maps interests me greatly, particularly for the African cultures that were exported. So thank you so much. He is not here now, but he posted that message for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well,
Okay.
oh, wait a minute.
Well,
no, I'm sorry. I'm just reading. Patrick O'Halloran is going to, he's unmuted himself. And Sushma, how can we make him appear on the webcam? Make him a presenter?
Yes. Just give me a second. Make a presenter.
So Patrick, you have the mic, so please speak. And we'll try to get your webcam going if you would like.
the floor is yours, Patrick. Whoa.
Please, if you are sharing your screen, you have to turn on your camera, webcam. It's on right-hand side, second tab. Yes.
Hey.
See him now. Okay.
And you can stop sharing your screen, please.
That's okay. Just ask your question. Just ask your question.
Okay.
Oh, is he muted?
You got to unmute.
We can hear you.
So let's see, audio, let's see, webcam. Attendees, okay. We're not able to get anything. Patrick O'Halloran, if you unmute your mic, you can talk. Okay. Well, we tried.
Yes.
So is this his screen or your screen, Walter? Dr. Gray?
This is Patrick's. This is Patrick's.
Oh, Patrick's screen. Okay. Oh, wait a minute.
Still can't hear you, Patrick. good to see you, though.
Yeah, you can write down your question. We can ask behalf of you.
Well, I sent it. I don't know. I know this is a difficult platform for people to figure out. So I did send it to him. So I'm not hearing anything now. So I don't know. Okay, well, I think in terms of our time, we need to adjourn now. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, we can see him right there. Oh, he's here.
Oh yeah, he's on camera.
Yeah,
Oh, I
he is
didn't
on camera, but his mic is not working.
Oh, he's trying to get it to work.
Yes, yes.
I see.
It's all good. We can always catch up. You guys have my email, and that's certainly available online. You can always come check up. But I definitely want to stay in touch with the group, and hopefully we can get more and more folks to join.
We'd love to have you come back and talk more about your project.
I gave y'all everything. I don't know.
Well, as you think further on it, that would be great.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
we thank you so much. And so Stan, I'll let you conclude, make the concluding comments for tonight's colloquy. Oh, you're muted. I can't hear you. Can't hear you.
You are muted, Stan.
We can't hear you.
Well, there we go. You got me?
There.
Yes.
All right. The press was hard enough. I'm sorry. Well, thanks, Walter, and thank everybody, all the board members, all the attendants. I want everybody to think about the conference. I urge everybody who participated to consider joining ECCSSA and participating in the next colloquies. Walter and I have already talked a little bit about next September, hopefully bringing him back for the conference. Follow us on social media and stay in touch. We will have colloquies coming up on the issue of race. And everybody stay safe.
Yes.
And good luck on the election, everybody. I have to say that. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Professor Shukla?
Yes.
I just was checking. I see we're the only two left. I should just go?
Yeah, because I don't know, I am not able to get off because of this poll. So that's what I was trying to figure it out. So, but I
Okay.
guess you go on top and you will see there will be log off tab. So you can just log off.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful to meet you. I hope we can talk more.
Yeah, and definitely. It was very nice presentation, very informative. I have lots of I am going to read that book that you have suggested. So it's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye.